And you're welcome to the RTÉ Rugby Podcast on the back of a pretty sobering weekend for Irish club rugby, with both Leinster and Ulster dumped out of the Heineken Cup at the hands of Saracens and Toulouse. Donal Lenihan, Bernard Jackman and Wesley Liddy alongside me to pick over the ashes of a European season that ends without so much as an Irish club in the semi-final. Gentlemen, you're very welcome. Bernard, I'll start with you. I guess there's very few highlights or positives to point from the weekend. The fact of the matter was that Leinster and Ulster were both beaten by better teams. It's probably as plain and as simple as that, is it?
Yeah, look, I think Leinster underperformed in certain areas, but they were well beaten. And, you know, you have to give credit to Saracens. The only thing you could say from Leinster's point of view, which positive, was there was a fight back and they showed good spirit. But, I mean, they'll have massive regrets around that first 40 minutes and elements of the second half as well. Look at a bit of their accuracy when they needed to be clinical, and they have been clinical all year. But fair play to Saracens. They came, did a job, showed incredible energy, skill, and power. And you know, Ulster just weren't at the race. I didn't even think Toulouse had to get into second gear. So difficult weekend for the Irish provinces, and a big setback. I think not just for Irish provincial rugby, but I think it gives us a little bit of apprehension around what will happen to the Irish team when they come up against teams like France, England, South Africa, who are, you know, bigger men and more powerful.
Well, this is it. Look, we'll come back into some of the detail in the Leinster match, in particular in that first half, Donal, in a few minutes' time. But I guess the overall picture is presented by what we saw at the weekend is, you know, what has Irish rugby learned over the last 2 years, where we've been running into bigger teams, being overpowered, out-muscled, out-taught? It seems very little on the basis of the two games from last weekend.
Look, I think firstly it's a bit of a generalisation to say, look, this all the Irish provinces have this issue. We have it when we play against England teams. It has happened at international levels in a number of games recently. But look, I think you've got to take that game in isolation on Saturday. I think we knew coming into the game that Saracens had real quality in their front five. It was no surprise to anyone that they were going to sprint out of the blocks at the start of the game. But if you look, Saracens had a very simple approach. They recognised, I think, from the early Pro 14 games that Leinster have issues at the moment with their line-out. They have issues with their line-out maul. They had issues in the backfield in terms of dealing with the aerial battle. So a very simplistic approach. It was based on territory. It was based on controlling the tempo of the game. And once they got a sniff, I mean, for the first scrum in the game, right from the kickoff, I felt they got a nudge on there. And, you know, as Bernard will tell you, when you're in the front five and you get a smell that you might have an edge in the scrum, well, that gives you a huge lift, and something that they went on to capitalise on throughout the game. I mean, the difficulty, I thought, for Leinster is they're used to controlling possession. They're used to playing this multi-phase game. And when it was taken away from them, I mean, the bottom line is they had very little possession in that opening 20, 25 minutes. They were a bit like sort of rabbits in the headlights in that they couldn't control the way they normally do. They couldn't get their hands on the ball to almost, you know, to execute a change. And, you know, I think Luke McGrath was having a bad game at scrum half. So, I mean, there was a sort of a whole load of errors that came together. I think you also have to factor in that there's a number of younger players who, you know, are in that Leinster side, like Cahill and Doris, Ronan Kelleher came in the second, or Andrew Porter even. James Ryan had only played that game against Ulster. Will Connors making his debut in Europe. So, like, it's not a surprise that it took them a while to react to what happened in a way, but it's very difficult to affect change when you can't get your hands on the ball. I think Saracens had a game plan coming into it. And, you know, the likes of Etoja, Vunapola and Koch, they just excelled throughout. They just couldn't deal with Etoja. I mean, I agree with Bernard. I like how he didn't get the man of the match was amazing to me. But that said, you know, it wasn't rocket science in the way that Saracens approached the game. I thought, again, all the talk about Farrell missing in advance. Wigglesworth took all the responsibility from a kicking perspective. Good is a very good footballer, but because Leinster had no possession, they couldn't put him under any pressure. And as a consequence of that, Saracens, at a period of the game in that opening 20 minutes, when you had to make them feel, oh, how are we going to survive without all the players who've departed, they actually grew in confidence and got better and better. Whereas Leinster seemed to go into their shells. They hadn't been tested to that degree for a long, long time. And it's very difficult.
On that, Donal. Okay, so if Leinster start the possession, right, and generally in rugby matches, you base your possession on the performance and the dominance of the pack. If the pack don't perform, you generally struggle to get possession. And, it did seem like Leinster ran into what they knew was coming. First of all, they were physically undercooked. And nothing that in the previous, say, 3 or 4 weeks, whether it was against Munster or Ulster, prepared them, it seemed, for what they were facing against Saracens at the weekend. And I just wonder, maybe are we in a bit of a bubble here with regards to Irish rugby and the Pro 14 at club level, where we think we are better than we are? As soon as the first big test comes along in terms of a big physical pack, be it in Saracens or be it on one of the French sides, and we crumble. Leinster crumbled at the weekend.
Yeah, look, there's no question that the Pro 14, we've spoken about this, on so many occasions. I mean, the standard isn't what you're going to meet when you get into the knockout phase in Europe. We've seen that on numerous occasions in the past. I think the circumstances surrounding this game were completely different. The lockdown scenario, the empty stadium, the fact that Saracens were in a position where they could focus on this and this alone for so long. And the emotional energy that we spoke about last week, that brought them to a different place. But yeah, I mean, I think, look, Bernard has been involved in management and in selecting teams, as I have over the years. There's always days, like hindsight is a great enlightener. I mean, I think, Leinster will look back and say, yeah, look, they did get some of their selections wrong. But, it was almost a perfect storm. You could see it. I mean, it reminded me, you go back to that 06 game against Munster in Lansdowne Road. Mallow Kelly fumbled the kick-off right from the start, and Leinster were on the back foot right from that moment. The same thing happened on this occasion. The surprising thing, as I say, is given the quality of players that they have, that they weren't able to address it. But I think Saracens knew exactly, in terms of controlling the possession, controlling with what positions the game was played in, that Leinster were chasing shadows and they just didn't know what to do.
Do we need to move away from the way Irish rugby plays at the moment, Bernard? And again, I'm not trying to be sweeping generalisation here. What I mean is, do we need to embrace aspects of the game of rugby union that take us away from being over-reliant on the power game when we come up against teams that have more power, bigger than us physically, than any team that we have, whether it be at Irish international level or at club level? Do we need to find a new way of playing this game that best uses the talents that we have at our disposal?
Well, no one's done it in any way successfully except Japan. And how successful is that going to be? Like, they're a very unique model in terms of playing this really high ball play, unbelievable skill set, speed, and detail. The problem is, at the moment, the way the game is set up is that and it hasn't changed that much, from 20 years ago or 50 years ago. If you have a very good pack who are very well drilled set piece, good kicking game, decent defence, and a goal kicker, you're going to be contenders. And more than that, look at the World Cup final. England, England, South Africa, very similar teams in terms of how they set up, built around size, power, defence, kicking game, and set piece. And it was South Africa did to England what Saracens did to Leinster at the scrum, which was the key factor. So we just don't see it very often between high-level teams where you can get such dominance. Either we get more powerful in Ireland and we find better athletes and bring them through, or we become way more skilled and creative. The problem is that all our teams can win 75% of their games by relying on power, because we are more powerful than most teams we play against. And that's not in the Pro 14, in the group stages of Europe as well, unless we run into a Saracens or Racing. Generally we're not too bad. So that's the issue really, is that, like, we could go in a different way, but we're going against where games are, or how games are won at the moment.
Okay, so
yeah,
guys,
I think, sorry, Hugh, I mean, he's absolutely right. I mean, you look at Ulster, to say this is, Ireland against teams from England and France, in terms of that power game. Ulster had Bath and Harlequins in their pool. They beat both of them away from home. There's only 2 or 3 sides that, have that collective explosive power that create the type of problems that Leinster had last weekend. And they've come across those before, and they've been able to deal with them, albeit Saracens in the final last year, where they had similar issues. It hasn't been an issue. I think you've got to have alternatives in terms of the way you scrummage and the way you use your line out. In other words, that you use channel 1 ball, you get the ball away quickly from the scrum. You can vary your line out in various ways to ask different questions. The issue for Leinster is because the problems that they encountered on Saturday, they hadn't come across them for over 12 or 15 months. They just didn't react to it. Now, that is a function of coaching in a way, in that they should have expected that there was every possibility that it could happen. Like the one thing, every prop forward in life comes across a bad day where it happens, where he just can't adjust to the issues that are presented on the day. You go back to that, people were talking about similarities at half-time between the 2011 Heineken Cup final when Leinster were behind against Northampton. The biggest issues they had in the opening half that day were in the scrum. Their scrum was under severe pressure that day as well. But I think Greg Feet came in at half-time. They spotted 1 or 2 things on the video. There was a little adjustment that Mike Ross made, and all of a sudden they solved that particular issue. And as a consequence of that, they were able to go on and play a bit more. So, there are technical aspects that created issues for Leinster on Saturday, and the disappointing thing is that they weren't able to fix them.
You can't underestimate how demoralising it is for individuals and collectively when you are getting pumped, getting your head pushed up your ass in a scrum like happened at the weekend. And that affects your general play. You saw Andrew Porter knocking on a ball in midfield. It takes your energy out of your legs. Your mind is trying to find solutions. Like, we don't see it very often, but when it does happen, it demoralises the whole team and affects everything else. It affects your backs. They start being trigger happy. The little ball they get, they want to do something with. And honestly, it has a ripple effect throughout the whole game.
Yeah, and Bernard, you know from experience, there's nothing more satisfying as a front 5 forward when you know you have the measure of the opposition in the scrum. When you're pleading with the number 8 to hold it in so that you're going for the second drive, the psychological effect of that is huge. And I think it had a major impact on Leinster.
Do you think, Wes, that, we're almost straight into the next season, really, the next couple of weeks? We've got to finish off the Six Nations, but we're straight back into the Heineken Cup, I suppose. We've got a November International Test Series coming up, but we're going to have to go and play England. We're going to have to go and play Wales as part of our 4-match pool series, and then, whatever happens at the final round of games. Do you think that there's enough in Irish rugby at the moment that will allow us to put, say, last weekend down as just a bad weekend at the office, that, collectively we're not quite as bad as was shown up at the weekend, and that, if we can fix the 2 things that did go wrong, the scrum maybe, the lack of possession and a couple of simple mistakes, that we're actually in a lot better place than last weekend displayed? Or where do you think we're at?
I think in the short term, there's very little option but to address it that way. I think in the long term, I think this is going to continue to happen sporadically against this kind of opposition without addressing it in coming at it in a slightly different way. I think it's very hard to explain. I think, and the lads mightn't agree with me, but I think Irish rugby has been based on best practice from committee level right the way down through the national team, the provinces. It's been based on good decision making and sensible decision making, whether that be in terms of coaching appointments and strength and conditioning programs, player assessment, whatever. And obviously that's a very good thing. But I think there is a danger that you become a little data driven in your approach. There is a danger that you become a little over analytical in your approach. And I think good, sensible decision making gets you 75% of the way there, or 95% of the way there. But I think when you talk about beating the Saracens of this world in a Heineken Cup semi-final, or breaking that World Cup glass ceiling, I think it's then maybe sometimes you need to deviate from the script at times, not just in terms of a game plan, a specific game, but having a kind of overarching strategic plan that gives you that extra 5% at times. And I don't think it's sacrilege to say, well, hold on, everything isn't rosy. Of course, there's things that can be improved on it, and you know, different type of athletes targeted, different skills prioritized at different times. So I do think there's things to be learned from it. Do I think they'll be heeded? Probably not, because I think there's an insularity about decision making in Irish rugby at times, and being honest, we're probably quite happy to get there 75% of the time. And maybe for all the flack Sarries have gotten, and rightly so, with the salary cap and everything else, and obviously they've been a team full of superstars at times, but there was a lot of very basic things in Sarries' approach that are to be admired. Any team can build that camaraderie. Any team can theoretically bring that work ethic, can execute those very simple tactics. So what Sarries are above all else that maybe we could learn from is, I think mentally they're a little bit harder on themselves. And I think if we're to go on and challenge, particularly at international level, at the highest level, I think maybe there are some harder questions to be asked about how we get there, because everything we've done, as good as it's been, 95% of the time, at the crucial moments, it hasn't been enough.
Okay, so that's really interesting. Donal, I mean, is that a mindset issue in Irish rugby then that can absolutely be addressed? It can absolutely be addressed. And I take your previous point, that, you know, when it comes to, you know, being able to deal with power, a lot of the times we are well conditioned enough, we are fit enough, we are strong enough to be able to absorb on our good days whatever England or South Africa or whoever throw at us. I absolutely accept that. Is it, as Wes suggests here, is it a shift in mindset perhaps among the players and the coaches to be able to get the pitch that's needed to win those crucial games more often than not?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very fair point. I mean, you go back to mindset, and you go back to what Wes just said about how we're process driven in Ireland. Look, we did brilliantly well under Joe Schmidt, but that was a lot of the way we played was so choreographed and so process driven that players were afraid to deviate from the norm. And I think, you know, when that expressed itself for Ireland at that time, we were thrilled with ourselves because incredibly we'd come off games and we might only concede 4 penalties a game, which is incredible. But I felt that there were times during that period, even when we were successful, players were so afraid of giving away a penalty that even when there was a kind of a 60-40 ball available to have a go for, we'd never go for it. Mm-hmm. It took that kind of that hard, nasty edge out of us as well, in that, you know, if you saw a fella on the side of a rock and his ribs were a bit exposed when you should be smashing them, which a lot of certainly the French and the English would do. We were, no, I'm not going to give away the penalty. I'm going to hold my head. And, you know, there's sometimes when you just wish that we had, that we deviate from that a little bit more. You go back to the question that Wes raised about Saracens, and I think he's 100% right. They've copped a huge amount of flack, which they deserve to do. They broke the rules in terms of the salary cap in the Gallagher Premiership. But they weren't spending a huge amount more than a lot of the French clubs were, and their budgets, in some cases, weren't as big as a lot of the French clubs who were competing in Europe. So therefore, there is no salary cap in Europe, so that shouldn't be an issue. But what they showed was a resilience and a collective will. Bernard spoke about it last week, about their whole focus is about making memories. You could sense a unity of purpose within that Saracens group that lifted players to a different level, that when the Leinster players and indeed Irish players, say in the World Cup or in certain stages during the World Cup, they weren't able to go to those places. They were used to things unfolding the way they had trained, the way they had prepared. They were used to running into certain areas of the field, preparing for the next phase or maybe 2 or 3 phases later. But sometimes you have to react to what's happening in front of us. Sometimes you got to go back and you know, listen, the mental side of it plays so much in sport that there's no doubt that Saracens were fighting for a far bigger cause than just beating Leinster last weekend. And sometimes that proves insurmountable.
But I think we're after really kind of hitting on something really important here, Bernard. I mean, this mentality in Irish rugby at the moment, like as Donal and Wes have just mentioned there, Saracens had that will to win. They're willing to do whatever it took last weekend to get the best out of that team and that squad to beat Leinster on their home patch. And the same cannot be said of Leinster for whatever reason. We've gone through some of the reasons there, and they're legitimate reasons. But there doesn't seem to be that hard edge in Irish rugby, whether it's at the national side, whether it's with Munster, Leinster. Yes, they look great when everything's going well in the Pro 14. They play lovely rugby and there's smiles all around and everything's fantastic. They don't seem to have that clinical hard edge to do what it takes to win when the chips are down and when it's on the line. Is that a fair comment or not?
Well, it is a fair comment. I thought Leinster had it, to be honest. I thought they built it, and having, qualified out of their group unbeaten and the record they went on, I thought they were just hadn't been tested yet to see it. And obviously the first chance they had to prove it this generation, or since last year's final, they flopped. So yeah, the criticism or the question mark around them is there at the moment, and until they answer. And in fairness, and I totally agree with Donal, they came here with a cause. But even before the salary cap issue, they were always able to get themselves up for knockout rugby. They've accumulated trophies, and despite being well paid and lauded and playing for the Lions and playing for England, when they come to Saracens, they turn up and they play for each other. So I think Mark McCall deserves massive credit for everything he's done with Saracens, but particularly for guiding them through this period. It can't have been easy in those meetings on a Monday morning when all the outside criticism, the club, club being told to keep the current crop he has happy and have them turn up as well drilled as they were, because emotion without a good game plan and good detail isn't going to work either. So I think he deserves massive credit. And back on Wesley's one, I think we have to be worried about Ireland's chances. To answer 5 questions, him one to go back Ireland's, because in form wise, we don't know. None of our 9s are standing up and are clearly number one. None of our 7s are clearly number one. If Tyke Furlong's out, is Tom O'Toole going to play at tight head? Can he do a job against the best teams? Who's James Ryan's partner? Maybe it'd be Henderson. He's finding his feet back. Who's going to be left wing? And who's going to be fullback? So there's lots of question marks around Ireland at the moment as well.
Yeah, there is. And sorry, just to go back to that point as well about Saracens, and indeed Leinster. I mentioned earlier on, I think Leinster had 5 players, 23, 22, 24. The likes of Cahill and Doris, who was an outstanding, and I thought was one of Leinster's best players last weekend. Will Connors, Hugo Keenan, Ronan Kelleher. When you're part of a group that's unbeaten for 15 or 16 months and who's winning 95% of your games, for the younger fellas, there's almost a kind of an entitlement feeling that every time you're going to go out that you're going to win the game. And by and large, these players have been that's been part of their norm since they've come into the Leinster setup. But every now and then you hit a wall, and as they found it like we've never come across this before. I think, it's a harsh lesson for Leinster last weekend, but in terms to write Leinster off is absolute nonsense. They have such good quality younger players coming through. Those players will be better for the experience that they went through. You could see it in their faces and they came off the field. They were hit by a juggernaut. They didn't know how to react. But they'll realise that the further you go in Europe, you get to the last 4, you're talking about a different level. Even if Leinster had got through, Racing would be a huge obstacle in a semi-final. And I think Exeter will come out the other side. Exeter have very similar qualities to Saracens in terms of physical power and in terms of being part of something, a huge movement in terms of what Exeter have done as a club over the last 10 or 15 years. So had they even snuck over the line, they got it back to 5 points, had they snuck over the line against Saracens, I think they would have been equally pressurised to win both the semi-final and possibly the final if they got that far.
Yeah. It's a funny...
Sorry, Hugh, just on Mark McCall there, I think it's worth saying, I read something during the week last week that his whole legacy or achievements with Saracens had this massive black mark against it now on account of what's happened with salary caps and all that. obviously his name will forever be linked to that, and it's a black mark against him personally, sure, but I don't think it's a black mark against his coaching. And I think he's a really good example of one of the criticisms leveled at him in Ulster was that maybe he was almost too much of a nice guy to deal with some of the issues that were going on there at the time. And lo and behold, he's not too much of a nice guy to deal with the massive egos and characters in that Saracens dressing room. So there's a prime example of a guy that had a very good skill set to begin with, and took on an outside influence and made himself better because of it. And I suppose that's the point we're hitting at. I was looking at the Connacht and Munster A game there before we did the show from the weekend, like, and a guy we've spoken about a lot, Thomas Ahern, for example, there. You know, I'd heard from people in Munster that he hadn't trained as well as they'd hoped after lockdown, and maybe that was why he hadn't featured at the start of the season. And he was quiet at times in that game the other day, but he had one or two moments where he did things that typically an Irish second row doesn't do in terms of his ability to pass out of contact, his speed, everything. And you wonder are the parameters he's been judged by at times, like, you know, how many rucks does he hit, how many tackles does he make, etc. While they're all perfectly valid, maybe at times we have to be open enough to look at things through a different prism and recognize other skills more if we're to match some of these teams in the most trying of circumstances.
That's a very interesting point. And again, you know, it's the legacy of the Joe Schmidt era. Donal, successful and all as Joe Schmidt was at various different stages for Ireland and before that with Leinster, it was a hallmark of his coaching regime with province or with country that it was very much stats focused. It was very much a repetition of a game plan that was structured, that was very airtight, and that really didn't allow for any deviation or creativity outside of his blueprint. I'm fascinated to see what Andy Farrell is going to do that might be different to that. And do you think that we now need to offer something different at Irish level to really kind of put it up to what we're going to face in the coming November International Series, which is the power of England, potentially, obviously, Wales, and beyond that, whoever gets to the final might come up against France or whatever it may be. I'm fascinated to see what Andy Farrell will do.
Yeah, look, we have to do something different. There's no doubt about that, because other teams have the measure of us now. I think at the end of the Joe Schmidt era, for all the fantastic things that he did, because it was so scripted, the opposition knew in advance of games exactly what was happening, with the exception maybe of a couple of different power plays off set piece or different attacking moves that they hadn't seen before. But in general terms, they knew how that Irish team played and they knew how to counter it. So therefore, you have to continue to evolve. And I think it's fair to say that we haven't. I mean, funny enough, I was coming out of the Aviva Stadium on Saturday, and the first fella I bumped into was Andy Farrell. And we just looked at each other, smiled, and said, Jesus, the scrum. And of course, I'd forgotten his son was playing in that World Cup final for England. And I said, yeah, look, we've seen it before, haven't we? Yokohama. And he was, yeah, but you could see, now, look, we only spoke for a minute or two, but there's no question in my mind that he is fully aware that Ireland have to move on and have to have a different approach. And to be fair to him, I think he had shown elements of that in the 3 games that Ireland played. The difficulty for him is, again, you're back to firefighting, in that Ireland play 6 games in a row now, and he'll have very little time with them to impose what element of changes he had. I don't think that Irish squad have been together, obviously, with all the COVID issues, since the game against Italy was cancelled. So that's 7 or 8 months ago. So again, you can't expect him to press a button and change the whole Ireland's whole approach in maybe 2 or 3 training sessions before a game. So that's always the biggest challenge at international level. The only time really that you can affect real change is when you go away on that summer tour and you have your 4 or 5 weeks together and you have time to sort of put the building blocks in place for what's coming down the line. So like with Andy Farrell, it's been a case of a feast or a famine. He had no games whatsoever and no time to prepare. And now he lives 6 games in a 5-week period. So
I think, Donal, in fairness, all the ills of Irish rugby are well summed up when the president of one of the most illustrious clubs in the country doesn't bother to turn up for a Munster Senior Cup semi-final because he's on commentary duty at the weekend. Would that be a fair point?
Fair to say if it was against... Yeah, it shouldn't be the young Munster match you're talking about, Wes, by any chance.
Oh, but it could well be. But sure, look, absenteeism is absenteeism, I suppose, you know.
Have to look after the day job, Wes.
Yeah. Before we leave it for this weekend, I'm going to ask each of you to give me your most likely winner of the Champions Cup as we head for the semi-finals this weekend. We have Racing, obviously, with Donal Ryan and Simon Zebo. We have Saracens, who we know what they've just done to Leinster. Can they sustain that level of performance given the amount of players that are missing from last year? We have a very good Exeter Chiefs side, very well coached under Baxter, and as I say, seem well capable of going and beating a Toulouse side that have one of the biggest packs I've ever seen in club rugby. But can you find a way to tire them out and basically keep the ball away from Chess and Colby? And Bernard, I'll ask you first. Who do you think is most equipped to go and win the competition this year?
Yeah, I think it'll be a Racing Exeter final with Racing to win.
Okay, Donal?
I agree with that 100%. I think Saracens, trying to lift themselves again. They had 7 months to prepare for Leinster. They have 7 days to prepare for Racing. The 1+, of course, they played them twice in the pool stage. But I think Racing will be bullying for that. I think Racing will win. Exeter will beat Toulouse in Exeter. And I think Racing, having lost that final to Leinster so narrowly in Bilbao, just that little bit of an edge. Now, the only caveat on that is where is the final going to be played? Probably in England, which could be a plus for Exeter. But then again, if there's nobody there, will it make that much difference? But I fancy Racing at this stage as well.
Wesley?
Very hard to call. Probably slightly veer towards Racing, and would absolutely love to see Donal Ryan win a European Cup, and love to see Mike Prendergast involved there as well. So I'll definitely be shouting for them anyway. Yeah,
I would love to see that too, but I'm going to go against all three of it. For what it's worth, I'm going to go for Toulouse to get past Exeter this weekend, and then a one-off game. But sure, look, anyway, it's all a moot point. There's no Irish side going to be in the semi-final or the final. And we do have a November international to look forward to before the Six Nations comes to a conclusion. This year's Six Nations, albeit slightly delayed. And we have the certain format of a Pro 14 that is yet to really take shape. I don't know what guys that will be. My thanks to Bernard, to Donal, and to Wesley for the company. Raphael produced today, and thank you for your company. We'll talk to you next week.